Arabic, an advanced course.
Sorry for that.
No. I think two mics are on. The mic has to be off.
Okay.
The mic has to be off. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Welcome to this talk again. Sorry for the technical problem. This afternoon's talk is by Professor James Dickens on thinking translation methodology. This is the model, probably also the one of the most detailed linguistic models of translation that Professor Dickens has been working on for a number of years, and he published his book 2016 on thinking Arabic translation, outlining this model in more detail. This afternoon, Professor Dickens is going to talk about it. Allow me to introduce the speaker briefly. James Dickens was professor of Arabic at the University of Leeds, United Kingdom, until he retired in September 2023. He has a BA in Arabic and Turkish from the University of Cambridge, 1980, and a PhD in Arabic linguistics from Hariwat University, 1990. He taught English at a government school in Sudan from 1980 to 1982, and lived in Yemen between 2000 and 2001. He has taught Arabic and Arabic English translation at the University of Cambridge, Hariwat University, and the universities of St. Andrews, Durham, Salford, and Leeds. His publications include Extended Axiomatic Linguistics, 1998, Standard Arabic, an advanced course with Janet Watson, Thinking Arabic Translation, 2002, and the second edition, 2016, with Sander Hervey and Ian Higgins. Also, he published a book on Sudanese Arabic phonetics and syllable structure in 2007, and thematic structure and parasyntax, Arabic as a case study, 2020. Professor Dickens will talk for 45 minutes, and we will have about a 20-minute session, question and answer session. And that's, I think that's it. So please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Professor James Dickens.
Thank you very much, Jabbar. And I'll put it onto slideshow.
Display?
Yeah, display. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. So, can we make it a full screen?
Is it not full? I think it's full screen there.
Again, it is.
You want to also see what?
Yeah, just make it a bit bigger for everybody.
How can I make it bigger? Huh?
Display settings up middle option.
Well, presenter view slideshow. Is that the one?
I think so. So, yes, thank you so much. And thank you very much to Sultan Qaboos University, for inviting me here today. So I'm going to talk about thinking translation methodology. This is intended to provide an overview, and I've produced this diagram, and Abdul-Jabbar has kindly produced a lot of copies of it. So hopefully that will make things a bit easier. There's a lot of material on these slides, and I'm not going to go through all of the slides in detail because that would take too long. However, if anybody wants to discuss things with me afterwards, you're very welcome to contact me by email and so on. So, structure of the talk. There's a series called Thinking Translation, Thinking Arabic Translation, Thinking French Translation, which we'll look at. And therefore, why? So the first time I'm going to talk about that. Secondly, I'm going to introduce this map, this textual matrices map. Thirdly, I'm going to look at the levels and matrices within it. So I'm going to start looking at the formal matrix. That's the things that make up what's sometimes called core linguistics. That is the standard elements included within linguistics. And they really are phonology, morphology, phonology and grammar, if you like. And then I'm going to look at beyond the formal matrix, so beyond the sentence, which is where traditional grammar takes us, to look at the discourse level, the intertextual level. And then beyond that, I'm going to look at other matrices which take us into wider areas of text, so into genre, into also semantics, which obviously is rather crucial for translation, into language variety, and into cultural matrix. Then finally, I'm going to ask the question, what does this model do? And perhaps as important, even more important, what does it not do? And then there's some references. Okay, translation, it's a long series. It started off in 1992. There's a French version, a German version, Italian version, Spanish version. There's also a couple of books, Thinking Chinese Translation and Thinking English Translation, which have the same title, but don't really use the same model. And finally, the Thinking German Translation actually does use the same model, the most recent edition, but somewhat picks and chooses, as they say. So it doesn't necessarily have all the elements of the model in it. So why the title Thinking Translation Methodology? This is my attempt really to both interpret and to some extent extend the model developed by Hardy and Higgins. So the model goes back, it's very old now, it goes back to 1992 when they published the first book, which was just called Thinking Translation. I think it deserves more thinking about as a model. So they provide really a sort of sketch of this model, and things are left unanswered, undiscussed. So I've really attempted to go back and think more about it. So I'm looking at this model and I'm trying to provide an interpretation of thinking translation, but I'm also trying to develop a larger methodology for thinking about translation. So that's why it's titled Thinking Translation Methodology. Okay, I won't go through the schema of textual matrices, simply to say that it's the same on here as it is on the handout. So hopefully we'll be able to follow this and relate, say, on screen to what is said on the handout. There are three key notions in the model. The first is a matrix. Well, a matrix is something like a general area of inquiry or a general area of analysis. Then there's a level, and levels really are defined in terms of, probably the most simple way of saying it is degree of abstraction. So if one starts off with the phonic graphic level, phonology, if you like, this is fairly close to sound. If you then got to grammar, it's more abstract. If you then got to discourse, perhaps more abstract still. So the levels are, the idea of levels is that they are degrees of abstraction. The idea of a rank is that it's a degree of complexity, and I borrowed the term rank from Halliday, so anyone who's studied Halliday's model will know that in Halliday you start off, and in linguistics generally, you start off, for example, in sounds with a phoneme, and then a phoneme you put together to make a syllable you can put together to make a graphic word, and so on. In grammar, you can start off with the smallest unit, a morpheme. You can move that, you can put morphemes together to make words. You can put words together to make syntactic phrases. So each of those degrees is a rank. And you're not making things more abstract, you're simply making things more complex. You're starting with simple things, combining them to make more complex things. So, basic notions in linguistics. This is a kind of interpretation of Saussure. So if you take a sign, you can, I think, reasonably define a sign in linguistics, in language, as words and grammar more generally. So the elements that include words and include syntax. You can then talk about form in a narrow sense, and that's the sound element of language, if you like. So phonology, or if you're thinking of writing language down, graphology, the written shapes of words and letters on a page. And then finally, you have content, and content is meaning. So meaning is semantics. So that's a very simple model of linguistics. I mean, it doesn't cater for everything by any means, but it's a good place to start, I think. The only problem from our point of view is that form is used in lots of different ways in linguistics, as people may know. And two crucial ways here is that form is sometimes used to mean phonology, graphology, but sometimes it's used to mean phonology, graphology, and also grammar. So when I talk about form later, actually, I'm talking more in terms of the area that's in the yellow or the orange, whatever color you think that is, on this slide. Okay, so basic levels of form in linguistics are really the phonic graphic level, which you could refer to as phonology, and the grammatical level, grammar. So this gives us, I've stripped down the formal matrix to just include these two most basic elements. And we can then start with the phonic graphic level. So you can think about speech and writing as two different but interrelated systems. So in speech, you've got the basic elements of sound, as people may well know. You've got the phonemes we can start with. So English has b and t and f and g and so on. And Arabic has similarly d and f and half and ha and ayn and all the other phonemes, all the other huruf in that sense that they're traditionally referred to in grammar, in Arabic nahu rather. And in writing, you've similarly got symbols. So English and Arabic are pretty straightforward. Arabic more so in this respect. So you have the dal and the fa and the qaf and the ayn as written symbols, which logically, they're clearly very closely related to spoken sounds, but logically they're different things. You know, even if we didn't know how Arabic sounded, we could all still read it. We could still decipher the different symbols. So, and then you've got symbols making up graphic words, and then you can go higher if you like. You might think of something like a graphic word group or whatever. So the point about here, as I said before, is that you haven't got things of different type. You've got things of different degrees of complexity. You've got simpler things like phonemes, like sounds making up syllables. You've got syllables making up what is sometimes called feet in English, so groups of syllables. And they're all of the same type, but they're becoming progressively more complex. Okay, so you can then, this is easy to do with speech. When you think about speech, you've got these things of degrees of complexity, but in fact, when we speak, there are other things that are going on, if you like, on top of, superimposed on. So this is why I've done a kind of box, because when you think about tempo, that's simply speed, pitch, whether you go up or down, loudness, whether I speak quietly or whether I speak very loudly, that's to do with, obviously to do with sound, but it's not quite the same as thinking about the individual sounds. It's features that carry on over the whole length of the sound event, if you like. So you've got those superimposed. And again, you can think of, in writing, you can think of things like italics or bold or underlining as operating, if you like, over the entire segment. So these are sometimes called suprasegmental features. And therefore, they're of the same basic type. They're still sounds, they're still written elements, but they're not dealing with little bits becoming more complex. They're additional material, if you like, which is on top of the individual elements and those combinations of elements. And the same actions we'll see obtains at the grammatical level. At the grammatical level, you've got the basic element is a morpheme. And if you take a word like disenchanted in English, I'm sure you've all done this, you can split it up into dis and en and chant and ed. And those are individual elements making up a word. And again, if you do Arabic, you have the same thing. So take a word like hadid, that you can think of the jadr and the wazn as being morphemes. And these are sometimes termed, what are they termed? Fixed morphemes, because in English, morphemes tend to be one after the other. So dis, en, chant, ed. But in Arabic, they're mixed together. So this is, the jadr and the wazn they're doing the same kind of thing as the bits of an English word, but instead of being separated out, they're interlinked. So, okay, and as we know, you can then take these words and you can put them in specific orders and you can get phrases. So you get in the house with bait or whatever. So you can then build up, and of course you can also include the clause in that. And you get to something that sometimes is called a sentence. And I think it's a good reason actually to probably call it a sentence base. And the reason for this is that actually in writing, there are things that go on beyond and in speech that go on beyond the simple aspect of syntax. And one kind of thing are variation in word order. So if you say, I went to the market in the morning, and you compare that with in the morning I went to the market, or in Arabic, if you look at that from a traditional grammatical view, and I think that's quite a good view, you would say in English, well, you've got a subject, you've got a verb, you've got a prepositional phrase dependent on that verb. And traditional English grammar, and to some extent traditional Arabic grammar, would say, look, whether you put the in the morning at the beginning or at the end, it's the same structure. But actually something else is going on that is, if you like, beyond syntax. And this going on, but what's going on beyond syntax gives you something more like a sentence. So there are these aspects. There are also aspects of intonation, the way we go up and down in a sentence. And in fact, in English and in Arabic, normally to finish a sentence, you go down at the end. So, and if you want to carry on, you don't go down, you go up, and then people know you're going to carry on. So actually, to define a sentence, you need to think about, is there a so-called sentential intonation structure? And therefore, to get a sentence in the full sense,
Is it on?
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So what do we get beyond the sentence? I suppose the obvious answer is we get to something more like a text. And I'm simplifying here, but I think it's a valid simplification. And within the Thinking in Translation series, Harvey and Higgins established what they call a discourse level. And for this, they're really interested in cohesion and coherence. And I think the reason for this is that they want to say, how do we take a very basic sense of what links sentences together with one another? And I think one could argue, well, how well theoretically integrated is this? And maybe not very well theoretically integrated, but I think in practical terms, quite a useful place to start when one's thinking about things beyond the sentence. So they take actually this notions from Halliday and Hassan of cohesion and coherence, which I'm sure people know about. And they're good, very useful notions, actually, that cohesion is all these words like wa and fa and thumma in Arabic and walidhalika and so on, and words like and so, therefore, finally, all these little words in English or Arabic or other languages that allow us to say, well, what is the sense of, how is the sense of one sentence connected to that of another, and actually beyond that to sentences that may be quite distant from one another. So cohesion is looking at specific words, and of course, actually, it's true that those words are part of syntax, as well as being, if you like, making cohesion, making cohesive links. And then coherence is this much more directly syntactically oriented notion, which one really would say, from a theoretical point of view, perhaps should simply be included in syntax. And that is that does the text make sense? That coherent text makes sense. We can make sense of them, but obviously you can only make sense of text where there is the potential to be made sense from. Okay, so yep. Are we okay on? We're not okay on the big screen. Okay, so we were looking at the discourse level. Beyond that, so if we think of discourse as taking us up to the level of the text, then in a general sense, we can also say, well, texts are not just individual occurrences. They actually, texts relate to other texts. And what Harvey and Higgins suggest is that there are two basic ways in which they can do this. They can relate in a very specific way via allusion or quotation, and they can relate in a much more general way by membership of particular genres. Okay, so allusion quotation, quite simple, that a quotation is where you say something which is clearly marked as having been said originally by someone else. So if you say, as Churchill said, we will never surrender, that's a quotation. It's nicely marked in English and in Arabic, or less, not perhaps so much always in Arabic, not even in English actually, but typically marked by quotation marks in Arabic and in English and similar things in Arabic. Or an allusion is when you're not necessarily saying exactly the same as the original person, but a reader is likely to understand the reference. So if you say, we will, if we're lucky, never surrender, which might be a rather ironic way of stating something, it's likely to be understood by educated English speakers that this is a reference to Churchill's statement, we will never surrender. Okay, so that gives us allusion and quotation, which are to specific texts. But genre membership is to do with not relationship to specific text, but relationships to whole class of texts and potential texts even that don't yet exist. So we can think of various genres. We'll come on to this in the next slide. Okay, so this gives us what Harvey and Higgins put together as the formal matrix, and I think they do it because they want to say these are elements of text which we have form in the sense that I said earlier, that they're fundamentally to do with, which they relate to fundamentally, either sound or grammar, or things that are similar to both, to either sound or grammar. So that gives us these levels, if you like, the phonic, graphic, and prosodic level, and together you might call those phonology if you use phonology in a more general sense. And the secondly, the grammatical and sentential level, so they fit together, and you might call that grammar or grammar plus because it's traditional grammar plus some extra things. Then the discourse level, to do with the nature of a text, and then the intertextual level, which is to do with the nature of the relationship between one text and another text or many other texts. Okay, so beyond the formal matrix, if we look at this, you can see the formal matrix is down here, and there are a number of other matrices which I'll deal with now, which take us beyond the formal matrix. So these are specifically the genre matrix, the semantic matrix, the varietal matrix, and the cultural matrix. Okay, the genre matrix, I've missed off on genre down here on the right, literary, religious, philosophical, empirical, and there also ought to be persuasive and hybrid. So that's my mistake, I'm afraid. There are lots of approaches to genre, and some people distinguish between genre and text type, and some people don't. Some people say genre and text type, same thing. Lots of definitions, lots of approaches. So, for example, Harvey and Higgins proposed this, and I'll look at this in a bit more detail. Sometimes people simply say, well, a genre is to do with subject matter. So sports is a genre, politics is a genre, engineering, geography, any of these things, anything you can call a subject matter could be called a genre. So some people look at institutional settings. So, for example, you get this in Mona Baker's book, In Other Words. So she would say one way of looking at genre is to think of, is it in a newspaper? And therefore, newspaper writing is a genre. So if a newspaper is a kind of institution in our culture, then newspaper writing is a genre. I suppose in the more modern terms, a blog might be a genre, might be. So this is another way, a sort of institutional setting approach to genre. There's also the idea of, well, what do texts do? And Rice, for example, has expressive, informative, and operative text. So expressive have an emotive element, informative have an emotive focus, perhaps. Informative have a factual focus, operative have a focus of trying to get something done. So some people also talk about things like instructional text and various other notion of what's the function of this text. And then there are lots of other approaches to text and genre. And I don't really want to attempt to solve the question of what's the best approach, which I don't think I'm qualified to solve anyway, but simply to note that there are lots of different ways of looking at text. And I did have a thought about Harvey and Higgins' approach. They give these 6 types of text: literary, religious, philosophical, empirical, persuasive, 5 types. And then they say that Western genres, until a few hundred years ago, fitted into this, but they never tell us why. And I think, unfortunately, Harvey actually died a long time ago, and he was the person who invented this approach. Because I've asked Ian Higgins, who I know quite well, and he said, well, I don't know, because this was Shandor Harvey's idea. So it did occur to me that maybe one way of looking at this is to start with pairing them off and saying, well, okay, we can look at things that are actual, and we can look at things that are desired. If we desire something, that gives us a persuasive genre. If we look at the actual, we can think of the real world, the non-fictional world, and we could think of the fictional world. So that would give us the literary genre, whether prose or poetry, in the sense that even if bits of this world are true, I mean, you can have a novel set in Muscat in 2024, and you can even have some real characters, but as long as it's not presented as fact, then it still has fiction. So historical fiction, you know, a novel about, I don't know, Salahuddin Layoubi is still a novel, even if there are facts in it, even if you can verify, even if the battles that are described are still real battles, as long as it isn't presented as history, as long as the writer is saying, look, I don't know all these things to be facts. I'm simply presenting a fictionalized account. Some of it may not be true at all. Then you're still in the world of fiction. So you then get literary. If you get non-fiction, things that really are not presented, these are presented not as untrue, if you like. They're presented as absolutely true. And you could then make a division between the spiritual and the non-spiritual, which would then give a division between religious and non-religious, if you like. And then you, within the non-spiritual, you could think of a distinction between the abstract, which would give you philosophical, and the empirical, the concrete, which would give you empirical. So that might or might not be a way of explaining Harvey and Higgins' genre analysis. When I asked Ian Higgins about it, he looked horrified and said, "I have no idea." So I don't have an idea either, but it might be a way of explaining it. Okay, semantic matrix. You've basically got two types of meaning, and this is generally accepted. I mean, I think it could always be reconsidered, but there's this idea that there's a meaning which relates to the world outside us in a very straightforward way. And the world outside us might be the physical world, which we always think of, but it might be the world of emotions, it might be the world of ideas, it might be the world of abstract principles like justice. So when I say the world outside us, it might even be the world outside us that's inside our heads, as it were, like emotions. So I don't mean the world outside us in a very crude sense. I mean the world that we believe to exist, of whatever type, phenomena that we believe to exist of whatever type, that are not simply part of the way we talk about the world. And denotative meaning, as you know, is basically to do with, well, what's the range of things that are covered by a word or a word in a particular sense. So what does pencil mean in English? What does justice mean? What does adala mean? What does qalam mean? And so on. And then you've got everything else, which is connotative meaning. And connotative meaning, I won't go into this, but it gives us these relationships that you probably will have studied: synonymy, hyperonymy, sometimes called superordinateness, superordinate, hyponymy, and semantic overlap. So these are the kind of basics, and they're based on logic, actually, set theory and logic. So they are hopefully quite well established. If anybody ever tried to work with them in looking at language, they turn extremely complex very quickly. So everyone presents these as if, oh, everyone knows what all these things are. Try and do some analyses with them, some real analyses. They turn out not to be simple at all. But let's say in principle, they should work. Okay, then gives us this other kind of meaning. It's connotative meaning. I'm not going to go through this list, but to take a couple of examples, Harvey and Higgins suggest 6 types. In fact, I counted 13, but I think someone else might count 45 or 83. And I suspect, you know, that the number of meanings you can get that are not denotative meaning may in fact go on and on and on and on. So just to give 2 examples: attitudinal meaning, the police, the boys in blue, the pigs is obviously pejorative. They all used to mean the police. And the first one's very neutral. The second one, boys in blue, is quite positive. You know, I like the police. The third one is obviously very hostile. And you can see that they mean the same thing. They denote the same thing, but they connote something very different. And again, you know, things like silence, please, shut up, if you like, in some Arabic dialects. they clearly basically mean the same thing, but in terms of what you want the person to do, but they clearly don't mean the same thing in what your attitude is. You know, the one is quite polite, the second is not very polite, and the third might be quite rude. So you have quite a lot of types of meaning that are recognized in Harvey and Higgins, and I say a lot more that you can recognize. Okay, so as if to prove my point, I simply included this big model that tries to compare Harvey and Higgins' approach, Baker, Kruse, and Leach. And you can see not only do you have lots of different terminology, some quite confusing terminology actually, in that what Leach means by associative meaning is very different from what Harvey and Higgins mean by it. And what Leach means by connotative meaning is again very different from what Harvey and Higgins mean by it. So you've not only got different typologies, different classifications, you've also got different terminology or the same terminology for different things, which is a problem in linguistics and also a problem that you'll have found, I suspect, in translation studies. Okay, beyond that, we've done the semantic matrix, we've got the varietal matrix. Varietal matrix, Harvey and Higgins suggest two basic categories. So they suggest on the left, the bit on the right is the diagram on the right is better, I think, than the one in the middle. In the left of that diagram, they suggest, well, you've got register, and they talk about tonal register and social register. So tonal register is to do with what we've just seen, affective meaning. It's to do with the kind of words you use to get a certain effect or affect. And social register is to do with what social group do you belong to? And their idea is that there are some social groups we belong to almost voluntarily. So if you're a middle-aged bachelor and you talk like one, then that's sort of voluntary. I mean, maybe being a middle-aged bachelor wasn't necessarily voluntary, but you know, the decision to talk like somebody of that kind, or an old socialist or something, an old person who is a socialist, can be voluntary. But then they say, well, actually, social register links to the second type, which you might call a sublanguage or a lect, where you get, first of all, socialect, where people belong, perhaps less voluntarily, to big social groups. So traditionally in Western societies, over the last 150 years, 200 years, you've had perhaps the working class, the middle class, the aristocracy. That's one way of looking at different social groups. And to some extent, your membership of those groups was pretty fixed. If you're a teacher, you're middle class. If you're a doctor, you're middle class. If you're a factory worker, you're working class. Now, maybe that's broken down. Maybe that's not any longer such a good model to use, although people still use those terms about themselves. But they felt to be less voluntary matters and more matters of where do you fit into the society. But then Harvey and Higgins say, well, okay, maybe sometimes sociolect, social register, it's not very clear if it's one or the other. So I attempted to accommodate that by putting the box for the cell for social register next to the one for sociolect. So you might say, okay, there's social features. You've then got geographical dialect, and that works very well for European countries, actually, where you think, okay, people in the north of England speak in a certain way. They say but, people in the south of England say but, people in the north of England say grass, people in the south of England say grass. So you can see very consistent sound differences, phonological differences. You can also see some differences in words. So people in the far northeast of England, they use the word bonny, which means good or pretty. Lass, which is found in standard English, very often used in the northeast of England for a woman or a young woman. Canny is in standard English means almost like cunning, knowledgeable, but in a slightly cunning way. You know, somebody who's canny with money, they know how not to lose money, they know how to make money. But in the northeast of England, it simply means good. So a canny lass is a nice girl or a good woman or something like that. So you get some word differences, and you even get grammatical differences. So there are, in standard English, people say the clothes want washing, but there's whole areas of the north of England where people say the clothes want washed. So, and these differences were much greater 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, but education has really pushed everyone towards standard English. And I think it's something, if you think about dialect in Arabic, well, it's quite interesting because actually, although I said it's geographical, a lot of dialect is to do, in some Arab countries at least, which Qabila do you belong to? So, and that's not, it's not exactly geographical because you can have the same tribes in the same area. So that's not a fully accurate or adequate discussion of dialect. And I think it's sensible to call those dialects in Arabic. But you can also see, I think in Arabic, happening very rapidly, how the most marginal dialects are beginning to be pushed out. So people are speaking more and more like each other. I mean, people tell me in Sudan that in the big cities in Sudan, everybody now tends to speak like people in Khartoum. But before, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, cities would have their own dialects. And that's true in English. It's true, I suspect, in lots of Arab countries. So dialects are interesting. They're moving together in English and in Arabic. And the big cities are, and the prestige areas are influencing non-prestige dialects and so on. But again, we still have clearly dialect differences in Arabic, which are bigger than those in English. And if you go to very rural areas in English, you'll find real dialects. Or if you go to Scotland, for example, you have strong dialects. And then finally, I added this one myself, but I think a temporal variety is worth thinking about, that people 100 years ago, 150, 200 years ago spoke differently. Words were used differently. I think presently was used differently 100 years ago, and I'm trying to remember what it was used for. Doesn't really matter. I think it presently meant immediately afterwards, and now it means at present, at the current time. So words change, usages change, grammatical features change, and so on. And within what we can still regard as a single language. So you get temporal dialects as well, and maybe if I thought about this more, you would have other kinds of dialects. So those are varieties. And then finally, you've got, this is slightly different, but when we think about two languages, unless you're thinking, there are a few languages that are really close. So within Europe, Czech and Slovak, and I don't speak either of them, but you can look at anything on a bit of, I don't know, a product. And if it's got Czech and Slovak together, you can see that these languages are virtually the same language. So actually, they're probably virtually the same culture. They're just two countries with two different languages, and they were one country, which also encourages people to have the same culture, obviously. So you do get languages where the cultures really are very, very similar, but you get far more cases, obviously, of languages where the cultures are different. And Arabic and English, the various English cultures, I mean, English, in Britain, we tend to think that in England, we tend to think England must be the center of English culture, but anyone who is a statistician will know that America is, and anyone who looks at the future will know that India probably will be, because there are 350 million people in India, 80 million people in Britain, 350 million people in America, 80 million people in Britain, and 1,400 million people in India. And it would appear that English is continuing to expand in India for various local and international reasons. So, okay, you've got different cultures, and even within English-speaking cultures, they're very, very different. And when you translate, clearly one of the really big challenges is what do you do with culture? Well, okay, so this is an attempt to expand Harvey and Higgins' view of what you can do with cultures. And I'm not going to go through this, obviously, but you've got a couple of extremes. So at one end, you've got the cultural borrowing. So if you have qasida, you translate it as qasida. If you have muwashsha, translated as muwashsha, that's a cultural borrowing. So basically, qasida isn't an English word. Muwashsha isn't an English word. I mean, clearly, a lot of words that were Arabic had become English. So, you know, Quran, Hadith, even outside the religious domain. Trying to think. Can't think of English. Miskin has come into French. And tabib is also tabib, I think they say in French. But and lots of things. So words that and phrases that have been borrowed. So they originally start out as cultural borrowings, but in fact become naturalized. So like the word curry, it wasn't English, but everyone knows curry, and probably millions of English people don't even know it wasn't originally English, because everyone eats curry in Britain like they do in Oman. So, you know, it then becomes part of our culture, your culture. So, and then you've got equally, when you look at words of extreme source culture oriented, you've got things like it increased the clay moistness. Well, that's not English. It's not an English idiom. It's not even English grammar. So if you use a translation like that, you're clearly saying to the reader, look, I'm trying to tell you something about the original Arabic. So that's very much oriented towards the Arabic. But on the other end of the scale, you've got the Romeo and Juliet becoming Qais wa Layla. So you've got something that moves the material entirely into the Arabic culture or from the source culture to the target culture. And then lots and lots of possibilities in between. As I say, I won't go into them. So this issue, I've tried to go through. I hope I'm still within my time.
Yes.
Good. I've tried to go through the entire set of matrices, levels, ranks, and also superimpositions. So that sort of covers everything. I think it's worthwhile saying, well, what does this do? And then what does it not do? So what it does do, what it attempts to do, is give us what Harvey and Higgins talk about, I think, as objective features. So they're saying these are things which we can identify in the text, which they say they're objective. What they mean by that is I can identify them and you can identify the same ones. Whereas if we listen to a poem and I say, oh, that was beautiful, and you say, no, that was horrible, then we're looking at the same poem, but we're not talking objectively. I mean, those are still completely valid. Subjective opinions are still valid, real opinions, but they're not things that are shareable and whose nature we can ascertain. I mean, you can argue rationally, of course. You can say, look, I'll tell you why I think this is beautiful, why you haven't understood it. But it's not quite the same as when we can say, look, here's things that I can really show you and we can agree. You know, you can argue about subjective things. In the end, you can say, okay, but you haven't convinced me. So, whereas with these, in theory, we should be able to say they're there, we can all agree. Okay, so that gives us objective features. There's also the idea, I think, that we had, is that we can have features which are coherent, that we can understand how they relate to one another. And I think this is also quite important, because you could say, okay, I can give you 1,000 features of a text, and they're all valid features, but they're simply a list. And there's nothing wrong with lists, but I think actually we get a clearer idea of things when we have structure and not just lists. So finally, as I say, we have matrices, we have levels, we have ranks, we have superimposition. Okay, so what's it trying to do? The attempt is to make a model which is sophisticated enough, if you like, complex enough, to think about text and the possible translations, but simple enough to be practicable. So I don't think if you showed this to any linguist, they'd say, look, linguistics isn't as simple as this. You showed it to a genre specialist, they'd say, look, genre isn't as simple as this. And I think that's true, but it's an attempt to say, how can we think about translation in a way which is makes sense, but also doesn't require 20 hours for every feature we look at. So it's practicable as well as being relatively coherent. That's the intent. Okay, so what did it not do? I think there are three things. There's a lot of other things as well, but three things when I was thinking about it. One thing it doesn't do is talk about effect. And effect is controversial in translation studies, but I think it is important whether you think about what did the ST author intend and what was achieved, what's achieved on the current ST audience. I mean, I can intend to persuade you, and you may tell me this is nonsense. You know, my effect on you wasn't the effect I wanted. And also, what about the effect on the TT audience? And it may be rather different, you know, and it may be intended to be different. So if I write some controversial polemic, and it may be intended to persuade the ST audience, but I may think, look, this will never persuade the TT audience. And as a translator, all I'm interested in doing is presenting this. I don't intend to persuade people. So you may not have the same intended effect in the two languages. You may not have the same actual effect. And then I think another thing that's interesting is equivalence. Okay, equivalence, it's another controversial thing, but I think if you define it as identity, that covers about 1% of translation correspondences. The other 99% are probably where you're much better to say, well, of course it's not the same, but it is significantly similar. And then you could say, yeah, but what does significantly similar mean? What's significant similarity as opposed to non-significant similarity? And I think probably, to be honest, we don't entirely know. I don't think you can define significant similarity. I think all you can say is, I think this is significant. And then you can get into a discussion about, is it, isn't it, is something else more significant, and so on. But if we think of equivalence as being significantly similar, so you take the Qasida, and you say, well, I want to translate this into English. What would be a significantly similar genre in English? Because we don't have a Qasida. And someone says the sonnet, and someone says, no, I think some kind of epic poetry form, epic poem form would be better. And you can discuss. You know, you can say, well, okay. And someone else says, no, I don't think either of those are acceptable. I think actually you want to maintain the formal similarity and produce something that looks like a Qasida, even though this doesn't look like a genre, poetic genre in English. So you had choices, and all of those might be said to be significantly similar in different ways. But I think equivalence, therefore significant similarity, is important when you think about translation. And finally, what it doesn't do, which is a bit ironic perhaps, is it doesn't tell you how to determine a translation strategy. If you look at the books, actually they do have, for all the practicals, they say, what is your strategy going to be? But they don't have a model for strategy. Now you might say, actually that doesn't matter. You could say strategy is to do with common sense, negotiation perhaps with the translation provider. You know, you go back to them, so what kind of translation do you want here? And sometimes it's obvious. If it's a technical medical text, they're going to say, get the technical terms right. Okay, get the genre right, but the crucial thing is get the medical terms right, get the logic of the text right. If it's a literary translation, maybe you can go back and have a discussion about the possibilities. But there are clearly, from the 60s onwards, people have attempted to say, how do you determine the strategy? And arguably, I think that's what Snyder's doing in 1964 when he talks about dynamic versus formal equivalence. I think it's probably what Newmark's doing when he talks about semantic versus communicative translation. It's certainly what Coller's doing when he has, I think, four levels of equivalence. And he's very explicit. These are different types of equivalence. And in a sense, his four levels, I think, are less rich. They're less of them than this matrix approach. But actually, they're very easily comparable. And I think actually, it's essentially what Skopos theory is doing. That it's kind of saying, what is the appropriate way of translating this kind of text in this particular context? So I think how to determine a translation strategy is very interesting. And I think probably, as with genres, you have two extreme possibilities. One is, well, we have a practical idea of how these things are. In practice, I can tell you what genre this belongs to. I don't need a theory. At the other end, you have the view that actually we really need a theory, and if we have a theory, it will tell us what all the relevant genres are. So, and some approaches in the middle. And I think again with how do you determine a translation strategy? Maybe I think some people would say, well, we simply need to look at each translation and think about it. And other people might say, actually, I have a complete model for how we can determine translation strategy. Or you could have something in the middle. So really, those are the sort of my ideas, my thoughts about that. I've got some references. Also, thank you very much for listening. And I'm very happy to take questions. I do apologize. I'm deaf and getting deafer.
Yeah.
That's a true fact. So if I don't hear you, I might ask Prince Abdul Jabbar to repeat. It's not your problem, it's mine, and not your fault, it's my fault.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Dickens, for this enlightening talk. Now, the floor is open for questions. But probably, if you don't mind, I have a small question to start.
Yeah.
To give you time to think of your questions. At some point in your recent writings,
yes,
you also proposed to add an additional matrix.
Yes,
which is the effectual
yes.
matrix.
This was this idea of, if effect is important, how do we deal with it when we're thinking about translation? And I suppose the issue is that let's assume that Harvey and Higgins' claim is right, that these are all objective features. Well, effect is almost like the ultimate subjective feature, because as I say, you might say it's beautiful, I might say it's horrible, you might say this is very amusing, I say I don't see the humor in it. But it doesn't seem something that's worth ignoring, or rather, it doesn't seem that it's something that we can reasonably ignore. And therefore, I thought maybe we could call it a quasi-matrix. Mm-hmm. So we can kind of admit that, I don't find this funny, but I can see that the writer was trying to make it funny. Do I try and make it funny in the translation? Do I leave it the way the writer left it?
And do you think this is not already covered under the connotative meaning? Because there's attitudinal.
Yeah, I know. I did think about that. And maybe it is, and maybe it's partly covered. And also, I think one of the logical weaknesses of this model is that things appear twice. Mm. So effective meaning suddenly turns up as tonal register. And you could, I think, logically, that's probably not good. But you might say, well, we're interested in this model because it's practical. And therefore, it doesn't matter if it repeats. Mm. So maybe it doesn't matter if some of the connotative meaning, you have an arrow going from some bits of connotative meaning to some bits of the effectual matrix. But I agree with you. And I think there is probably a danger of inadvertently simply repeating everything because you think you've got something different when it's not different. So yeah, I think it's a good point.
Not so. Okay. But there are no questions, huh? But are we still online now? Okay, yeah.
You are online.
Why is black?
It's okay. You can open that.
Okay. Until we get, there is a question. Okay. Let's give the floor a chance to ask, and then we'll go to the chat. Any question from the audience? Yes, please.
Mhm.
I have some concrete pedagogical
Yeah.
concerns.
Yes,
Before that, the question related to the formal matrix.
yes,
We can see the morphological, syntactic,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
semantic, written, spoken. All these things are which are present in any text,
yes, yeah,
in any source text,
yes.
to be rendered. I don't see any reference to rhetorical structures, which are not semantic, not grammatical, not morphological, such as the use of binomials, multinomials, parallel construction, divided
Yes.
by parallel construction, all these things is
Yeah,
part
yeah.
of the content.
Yes, it is. I agree with you.
Well, because I checked the writing, and the
Yeah.
writing, perhaps because normally associated with writing, these
Yeah,
rhetorical
yeah,
techniques.
yeah.
But even in spoken discourse, we can detect the use of certain techniques which are purely rhetorical.
Yes.
So, is it a gap?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, the model has metaphor somewhere, and metaphor can be related, I think, to both denotative and connotative meaning. I think the other, you know, I mean, if we use the Arabic classification kinaya, I think the same way. I think metonymy synectically can be. I think you're right, and I'm just trying to think out loud that I did put in this. This is sort of a book I'm writing. I did put in a chapter on parallelism because I think you're right, and I think I would need to think about it more. But I think it's a very good point that how do we fit in all these rhetorical features, because they're not just features of genre, for example, and they're not just features. I mean, they obviously involve using, for instance, repeated grammatical structures, repeated lexis, repeated vocabulary, but they're not, you know, probably they're not just a matter of those things. So I will think about that because I think that's a good question.
Second part of the question.
Mhm.
So the question directed to Professor Dickens, the Professor Barrett.
Yes.
Our students, translation students, encounter concrete problems
Yes.
related to the formal matrix, the grammatical extension,
Yes.
whether into English or into Arabic.
Yes.
There is an external problem which is not taken into consideration, which is often pedagogical grammar induces learners into error.
Yes.
Take the case of Arabic. It's not only Arabic, even in English.
Yeah.
We have a
Yeah.
concrete example.
Yeah.
In Arabic, so the approach is, and it dates back to 10 centuries ago.
Yeah.
To the 10th century.
Yes.
The same approach, outdated, not updated,
Yeah.
and is still dominant in pedagogical.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, when you consult any grammar book, textbook,
Yes.
in any Arabic country,
Yeah.
you will not find a chapter devoted to modality. And there is not even a word for that to be defined. Not a chapter on outfit,
Yeah.
not a chapter on mood.
Yeah.
And how do you expect students to understand who's been reading, for instance, War and Peace?
Yes.
Where the aspect is complex.
Yes.
And there is no previous to their background.
Yeah.
There is nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing on aspect. Even the word aspect.
Yes. Yeah.
Traditional grammarian talk about shape.
Yes.
It's not clearly persuaded.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I prefer to talk about elder fact. But in Arabic, the focus was on tense.
Yes.
Reference to fact.
Yes.
Essentially.
Yeah.
And aspect was neglected. Whereas in English, it's central. And in translation, it's not something we have in common.
Yes.
You cannot ignore that. Modality. The only type of modality which is really detectable in any grammar manual is a tawqid, corroboration.
Yes.
It is still modality.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
And here, when I don't blame the student bear
Yeah.
the consequences
Yeah.
of the approach,
Yeah.
the grammatical, traditional, normative, semantic oriented,
Yeah.
and context insensitive.
Yes.
Still sentences with Zayd and Amr, and you say
Yes. Yeah.
story,
Yeah.
recurrent.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we teachers encounter problems,
Yes.
and our students encounter problems as well. But at least the solution at the English department found
Yeah.
is that one, we cannot teach grammar to translation students, grammar in general. It
Yeah.
should be translation oriented,
Yes. I think so.
tailored for the needs
Yeah.
of our translation students. The same thing for morphology.
Yes.
So it's translation oriented morphology, translation oriented syntax.
Yeah.
And second, to make of our research agenda in the service of the class. So when we work
Yeah.
on particular topic,
Yeah.
preferably it should be related and derived from the real experience.
Yes. Yes.
So this is the problem. How do you see that?
No, I think that's very interesting. I think you sort of thinking about it, I think you provided the solution where you said we need sort of Arabic for translators and English for translators, and really looking at the contrastive features. I mean, looking in two directions, really. One is what's going on? How can we understand these features of the two languages in theoretical terms, or fairly theoretical terms, but also how do we see them relate to one another? Where do they cause problems? Because in a way, you don't, I mean, things that don't cause problems are not a problem. And therefore, where Arabic and English are similar, it doesn't, to some extent, matter if we don't really understand what's happening in a really deep theoretical sense. Because for a practical translator, all you need to know is there's swimming. But where they're not swimming is, you know, you know, and I think that you see it with really advanced learners still have difficulty.
So even in English, the so-called progressive form.
Yes.
There are different contexts where it
Yes.
does not convey any continuity of the
No.
event.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's-
Yes. Yes.
For them, I mean,
Mhm.
this is sacred.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and that's why any sentence with B plus
Yeah.
ing is to be understood as an event, and making headway.
Yes. Yes.
Which is not always the case.
Yes,
When
yeah.
Nietzsche, for instance,
Yeah.
talks about 14 meanings.
So really, this is
teachable, not learnable.
yeah. So this is a really complex area, and you know, similarly, it's quite interesting. I was helping to revise a translation of something about frankincense in Dhafar recently, and it had this very interesting. It used the mudari' throughout, but it was clearly in the past. But then there were things that it wasn't really clear whether it was actually only in the past or whether it still happened. So you have a problem in English because English only allows you to either use the present or to use the past. But the mudari' in Arabic has a flexibility, which means that you can be talking about the past, you can be talking about the present, or maybe you could be talking about both. So yeah, I think these things are very interesting and very difficult. And certainly one can see, you know, the English tense plus aspect system is extremely difficult, extremely strange, actually. Yeah, you know, someone pointed out to me years ago that in football, on television, when they talk about football, they use the perfect. They say he's moved the ball into the middle of the park. He's seen the attacker on the right. He's sent a high ball over. And then you think, well, why is that the perfect? And it's actually a kind of generic thing. that it's to do with that context. And probably you could determine when it first began and when it first developed. And before a certain date, people probably didn't use the perfect. They used the simple past. So these are really difficult and complex things, yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Habib. Any other question from the floor here? Yes, Dr. Abdul Karim.
So, thank you very much for your interesting talk. I just have a question about the methods you have just illustrated, thinking translation methodology.
Yeah.
And how this metrics handles ethical dilemmas in translation, like translation ideology.
I don't think it does, and I think, I think because it's objective features, and I think we're then into. I got a question here about translation assessment, and I think even things like translation assessment, okay, one can see perhaps translation assessment easier to apply, but ethical issues, I think it probably doesn't. And in a way, the kind of interesting thing is that, if you think of ethical issues as being to do with almost beyond strategy, all these really, if you like, high-level things. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I don't think the model does. I think, there are things beyond the model where you would say, okay, these other things are imposed. These decisions are imposed not by the nature of the sort of formal nature of the text. They're imposed by higher level decisions, So yes, I agree with you. I think, like all models, it's limited.
Any other question? Yes, please.
Professor, I would like to thank you first of all for giving us this amazing.
Can you come closer so that
So I can hear
the online people can hear you?
So I didn't want to interrupt while coming in. So I would like to thank you first. And you said something about people from the same area having different dialects.
Yes.
There are people in the same house who have different dialects.
Yes.
So, this is a very complicated area.
Yeah, absolutely.
That you brought it up.
And it's certainly not just geographical in Arab countries, is it? No, and there are people in, Sudan, where I work, people in the same village have different languages.
Yeah.
So, even more extreme things happen. And it's very complicated, I agree, yes.
Any question from the audience before I move to involve our online guests? There's a question from Abdul Aziz. Oh, yes.
I'm sorry for being late.
That's okay.
I had to drive all the way to SQU. So my question is related to your book, Thinking Arabic Translation, which is really an amazing book, considering the novice translator. But my question, is this book now still relatable to the current issues or topics, let's say, in translation? Keeping in mind, the way Arabic has evolved. The people have what's used to be taboo, let's say 10 years ago, or let's say 5 years ago, it's fine now.
Yeah.
Also, what is concerning the conflicts that's taking place at the moment, some countries, some Arab nations, they consider it's fine. Some Arab nations, it's still they have this Arabic nationalism within their language. So maybe I think, in my opinion, it's time maybe to have rethinking Arabic translation.
Well, that might well be. Yes.
Adding maybe a chapter at least discussing this aspect of
That's a good point.
That's my question here.
Yeah, I think that may be right. And of course, it's one attempt. I suppose the thing that struck me is actually almost all translators now, what do? You put it through Google Translate. So actually, I did a little experiment with Google Translate 2016, 2019, 2024. And 2024 is much better than 2016, better than 2019. And, you know, there is an issue of, in fact, I put a bit at the beginning of this proposed book about, well, couldn't you say the basic methodology of translation is to put it through a machine translation program? So I think there are lots of issues. I mean, what we know is machine translation doesn't yet do everything. It might do everything for very basic text, but it doesn't do everything for text of any complexity. But you can't, it seems to me, forbid students from using it, because that's what professional translators do. I mean, my daughter does some professional translation. I said to her, what is from between Spanish and English. I said, what do you do? She said, I put it through Google Translate and edit it. You know, I mean, of course that's what you do. And I think, therefore, I mean, there are perhaps these, you know, these issues of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, are also important. You know, what's taboo, what's not taboo. But of course, they always kind of shift. You know, that what's acceptable in Tunisia is probably not what's acceptable in Qatar, or vice versa. You know, what you can say, what you can't say. I mean, sometimes there's straightforward political reasons. You don't say something because it's, you know, not necessarily advisable to do that. So, yeah, I mean, you know, and it's happening in the West. So these things are, I think they are all the kind of really high level things that a model like this doesn't actually deal with. And, you know, I think the simple response is to say, well, a model like this doesn't claim to do everything. And I think, you know, that's true of most models, but, you know, what's the best translation of a certain text in a certain context? Probably the best thing is not to translate it at all, because it could be quite dangerous. So, you know, that's a kind of translation decision, if you like.
Right. Okay. If there is no question from the floor, I can actually bring someone from the online platform. Abdul Aziz is asking, why not add translation assessment to the levels you propose? Translation is basically a constant process of assessment and decision making.
I agree with that. I think that it's a model for looking at translation. If you think about taking strategic decisions and being able to discuss those, you can then use the model as in assessment. So I think rather than adding assessment to the model, think of it as being a model you can use as in assessment, as part of your, as an aspect of thinking about your assessment, as well about thinking about the translations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Hala says, how does the model count for extra linguistic factors such as target audience, medium of translation, etc., which affect translators' choices, such as in subtitling, for example?
Yeah, and I think that's why one needs to think about strategic decisions, because I think all of those are to do with strategic decisions, which you've kind of got to take first before you think about everything else. So, and I think, you know, I mean, subtitling is not something I know a lot about, but it is an area where you've got to think about length, for example, and you've got to think about what's crucial in the message, what isn't crucial, as well, perhaps as other things like register and so on. But, you know, clearly you have length constraints in subtitling. And those are things that I think are specific strategic type features of the translation. So I think it, if you like, they fall outside the model, but like all strategic decisions, they're going to influence what you can do in terms of the model.
Right. Thank you very much. Another question by. Sorry. I'm going to answer here. Someone called Asil or Asil Can someone type the questions being okay? So this is just a suggestion.
Yeah.
Okay. Abdulaziz has another question. Says, where does your model fit in the age of large language models and AI?
I think, yeah, it's a good question. They're going to provide information that's useful for a translator. So if you think of things like collocation, clearly corpora will provide you with very reliable information about collocation. And collocation, I think, is particularly interesting. When I've done work with students on collocation and they've used corpora in the class, it's very interesting that my intuitions are not always correct. So, and I don't know if I suspect work has been done on this, but I think they provide objective information, again, of the type actually that fits in the model, if you like, but of a type that we think as native speakers we have indirect access to. I mean, I think this is a common collocation, and then actually there's no evidence it's a common collocation. I've not seen any research on this, but maybe people have researched, I imagine they have, on the differences. What differences are there between people's view of, for example, common collocations as native speakers and what the objective data tells us? So I think you can make use of all these things as really useful aids to translation and things that may well correct even your own view of your own native language.
Thank you very much. So basically, we first establish our intuition from applying this model, and then probably go beyond to check.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Any more?
It's related to dialects. It's hard to define language, but if there are two dialects, for example, for Arabic,
Yeah.
and there are dialects for Arabic, but there are dialects that have different syntax, phonology, and morphology.
Yes.
Can we call those languages? Because it's totally different.
Well, I mean, you probably know this, but someone said once, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And I think, what they meant was that actually we tend to think of things that have national status as languages. And, sometimes in Arabic, certainly people would say, oh, it's a lahja. And you think that that's not what I would call a dialect. That's what I would call a separate language because, it's not Arabic at all. So I think there are two ways of looking at language and dialect. One is the view that derives from one's culture, one's nation, and the view in Arabic, which I think is a fundamentally sound view, is that there's Fusha and there's Ammiya, and they're both Arabiya. That they're not somehow different languages, and I think that's sound from the perspective that actually everybody speaks the dialect, everybody speaks Ammiya, everybody who goes to school learns Fusha, everybody who goes to goes to the mosque learns Fusha or learns some Fusha. So that this is part of, if you think of language as being a cultural whole, then of course this is a single language. But then if you apply a different criterion, which is the very, specifically linguistic one, I think one would say, yes, of course, if these versions of the language have different morphology, different words, different syntax, different accents, different speech rhythms, everything seems different. Well, of course they look like different languages. And, if you took Maghrebi and Iraqi, and I think almost everyone would say, well, of course they're both Arabic, but I mean, they can't understand each other. There must be different languages. So, you know, we have a kind of tension. And the same is true in English, actually, that if you go back a few hundred years, people in Scotland wrote in a style very different. No, not in a style, in a version very different in its grammar, in its spelling, in its vocabulary from the version used in England. Now, what happened is that at a certain point, people talked about Scots, and they talked about it as a separate language. And it really was. I mean, the word order was different, the grammar was different. And then with the sort of dominance of English, it became less and less felt to be a separate language, and more and more felt to be a dialect. But there are now people in Scotland, I mean, perhaps partly because Scotland has its own nationalist movement, you know, movement for independence, that say, oh, we think this is a language. So, you know, I think you could say that people who still speak what's sometimes called broad Scots are speaking a different language, because so much of it is different from English, even standard English, that actually from the criteria you gave, you know, the morphology, the syntax, the phonology, they're all different. And I think there are multiple definitions of what language is meant by language. And I think depending on which definition you use, you would say, oh, it's all Arabic, or you would say, well, they're different languages. And I think they're both valid. They just use different definitions of what a language is.
Can I add something here? That you said they share the same. They don't share the same structure. Yes, they don't share the same two dialects, or the dialect and the standard language. They don't have the same structure and structural differences. Is this confirmed by research? How do you know? Because it's not easy to prove that structurally, for instance, the Omani dialect and the standard Al-Fusha, they diverged into two different languages. And to prove this structurally, we need research, to conduct research covering the areas of syntax, at the level of all grammatical operations, modality, negation, interrogation, and so on, to prove that.
Yes.
But if it's just an intuition, perhaps intuition based, that we speak two different dialects, does it amount to say that the second dialect is a language?
I mean, that's also a good point.
Yeah.
I think that, I mean, clearly there are things that, and from my point of view, that are shared between Fusha and Amir. And, you know, the things that are rather obvious, that you put the noun first, you put the adjective after it. If you have al on the noun, you know, you have al-bayt al-kabir, you have agreement, you know, al-madrasa al-kabir, al-bayt al-kabir, and so on. So there is clearly a lot of shared material, but I don't know, it seems to me, if you look at different dialects, in Fusha, every question word goes at the beginning, sorry, so madha turid. But in lots of dialects, the question word either goes at the end or somewhere else in the sentence. And in some dialects, it either goes at the beginning or in the end, depending on some other factors. So I think if we call that structure, then you could say, well, in that respect, dialects are different in structure. And for instance, in Khaliji dialects, you get a lot of jumla fa'aliyya. So you get the verb first. But in Sudanese Arabic, you only ever basically get jumla ismiya. There really hardly is a jumla fa'aliyya unless you don't have the subject. And then you can have the verb first. So it seems to me there are things that one could say are structurally different, but I think your point is a good one, that there are also things that seem to be shared between all forms of Arabic. And there is one version of Arabic a bit like Libyan or Tunisian Arabic. Yeah, but it has a lot of French words, a lot of Italian words, English words, and so on, and it has new verbs.
The reason
Sorry, say.
Yeah, and a lot of Tunisian dialectal words.
Yes, yes, yes. So really, it's a kind of interesting example of, again, perhaps people would say it's a language because it's an independent state, because it doesn't use the Arabic script, maybe because it has this big influence of European languages, but fundamentally it's an Arabic dialect, isn't it? You know, you look at it and you can see it looks like North African Arabic or Tunisian or possibly Libyan, Western Libyan or something, but it's that one is able to define what it's like. It's not like Iraqi Arabic. I mean, it's clearly more like Tunisian, as you say.
Right, I think time is over. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
This informative and enlightening talk. And yeah, we hope to see you again here in the department. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
And also another way to say thank you to Professor Dickens. Here is a certificate of appreciation presented from the college and the department as well, to say this is the first of many to come, right?
Yes.
Looking forward, inshallah. So, thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. Yes. Shall I come with you?
Yes, please. Yes.
Just like that.